We will this morning continue in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14. Mark chapter 14. And we'll be picking up from about verse 22 and onward. Let's recall from where we've come in Mark chapter 14. We considered last week that scene when the woman comes to pour some very expensive perfume and to anoint Jesus. Mark doesn't mention her name, but we know from the account in John chapter 12 that it is Mary, and Mary, the sister of Martha and of Lazarus. What is she known for? What, if you're going to define her, what's the first thing you'd say about her?
Jesus' feet.
She's always, what's her first priority? To be as near to Jesus as she can be. She's always there. There's always other things that could be done, as her sister Martha well demonstrates. But Mary's heart is just to be where Jesus is. And certainly she's proving it in that time. To be with him, nothing is more important. You know, really for her, nothing is even a close second place. And her devotion to Jesus is as pure as that perfume that she poured on him. And it evidences as well that her trust is just as strong. And so in Matthew chapter 14 and verse 8, we noticed last week that, you know, if anybody in this whole scene understands what's going on, that has a sense of what really must happen, it seems it must be Mary. You know, she understands that, as it says in Mark 14 and verse 8, if I can get my fingers to work. Jesus says she has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for the burying. It seems that she's the only one that understands what must happen. She knows that Jesus has been appointed to this. She so trusts that in this, whatever must happen, that he is accomplishing the good and the perfect will of God, that she is blessing him for the hope that he gives her. That's the level of her trust already, isn't it? So devoted to him. I mean, she is, you see the evidence of it in her life. She is already Mary's reason for being. That's her purpose for living. And it's so crucial in recognizing that. It is, as we considered last week in John chapter 1, when Jesus is manifested after the resurrection of being the Lord. It was that one disciple whom Jesus loved, the one who was most devoted to Jesus, John, that was the one that recognized him first. And you see it in both Mary and John in that way. Who is it that first really comprehends, who understands, as best can be understood to that point, why this must happen? It's always those who are most devoted to Jesus who understand first. Well, today we come to Mark chapter 14 and verse 22. Up to this point, according to Jesus' instruction, 2 men have been sent to prepare the way. 2 men were sent to requisition and to obtain a room in a private house. And there Jesus and his disciples would observe the Passover. After the traditional Passover meal, after Judas departs, Jesus uses 2 of those very simple elements from the meal to figuratively enact his death. And he instructs the disciples in their taking of this, in their partaking. And in the partaking of it in likeness to that, Jesus, they receive the benefits of this death in participating in it. in verse 22, chapter 14 and verse 22. And as they were eating, he took the bread, and when he had blessed, he broke it and gave it to them and said, "Take, this is my body." Well, it's literally the word for a body, but figuratively, what does he mean? Spiritually, what he means. Take of this body that is given in your stead. I'm giving mine, so it's not required of you. Verse 23, and he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave to them, and they drank all of it. And he said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly I say to you, I shall no more drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." That is a loaded passage when you get to taking it apart, isn't it? I mean, it's so much. He literally took a cup. Figuratively, he took what? Spiritually, he took what? Pardon?
His blood spiritually.
Yep. He's taking that cup of suffering to himself, isn't he? That's what has been allotted to him. That's what is appointed for him to take. He took a cup. Can I chase a rabbit here? I watched another one of those shows recently where it talks about the search for the Holy Grail, this golden chalice thing. Can it even be so? No, it's not so. Jesus, none of the priests loaned him a golden chalice out of the temple. He certainly didn't go in there and steal one. You know that whole thing, let's search for this holy cup, this thing, so we can worship this. It wasn't a golden chalice, it was a cup. You know, it's so much of that Hollywood hogwash, really. There's a notion that Joseph of Arimathea took this chalice and he held it up to Jesus' body and drained the blood into that cup. No, he didn't. You know, it's that religious myth, which is true of so many things. If we have some object, if we can find some object, that is what we want to worship. But it is by this simple unleavened bread and grape juice from a cup what was established. Of course, it's a memorial. Specifically a memorial to the covenant, as he said. It's the blood of a covenant. I was thinking about this. Think through the Bible, through all the many memorials throughout the Bible, those that are established in conjunction with the covenant. Actually, all of them are. Even if it was merely a jar of manna, or if it was an altar built somewhere out in the wilderness, if it was just a stone, if it was a stack of stones where somebody crossed a stream, what's the significance of it? It's always a sign of a covenant, isn't it? How did they cross the stream? Because promises that he would deliver them, that he's going to lead them where they need to go. In these memorials, there's always a sign that is related to a covenant promise, and then its fulfillment is celebrated with a meal. From the very first in Exodus chapter 12 in the instructions for the Passover. And then think about here through the instructions of the Lord's Supper. And ultimately in Revelation chapter 19, that marriage supper of the Lamb. What is it? In every case, the telling of it. There's a sign based on a covenant promise fulfilled in a meal. And so, what's the sign? What's the promise? In this covenant of blood, what is the promise? Well, the forgiveness of sins and this new life. It's remembered in the grape juice, but again, why blood? Why blood? Why did it have to be blood?
Life-giving power.
What's the Hebrew writer say, Hebrews 9 and verse 22? Without the shedding of blood, there is no what? No forgiveness of sin. Particularly without the shedding of innocent blood. That blood of the covenant celebrates what God has determine God's arrangement to bring us back into relationship with Him. There's no other way to do it, is there? Yes, sir.
Yeah, American Standard has a margin on it that says some authorities insert new covenant.
Mm-hmm. Which would be right and true, because the emphasis is the old is passing away. It's not that God's plan or His promise or His purpose is changed. That's eternal, but the progression to get to that, it is a new covenant. Yes.
And then, in the Old Testament, it's always, everything is leading up, and it's the sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's all just leading up to what has to be done, for Jesus's.
And as in this case, there was always a preparation for it.
Yeah.
You don't just do it. There's always a preparation. I often fear we don't do enough to prepare for it. It is good in that sense, Hubie, that says a new covenant. What's different about the new covenant? I talked about it in a sermon a few weeks ago related to Easter. In the Old Testament, you find those words about restoration and forgiveness. You can find all those words in the Old Testament. The one word you don't find, and you only find because of a new covenant, is reconciliation. There's no reconciliation to God without this new covenant. And so it's celebrating God's arrangements to bring us back into relationship with Him. Another thing I want us to consider is this is not a kind of quid pro quo agreement. This isn't one of those things that because you take of the Lord's Supper, that you're assured of everlasting life. Sometimes it gets construed that way. There are those that teach that in taking this, particularly in a religion where the high priest serves it, that he is extending grace through his giving those elements to you. That's not it. The grace is extended in the obedience to keep the covenant, in the conditions of fulfilling the covenant. It's not that it's a sacrament in the sense that grace is extended through this. This is the remembrance of the grace that's abundantly extended through the death, burial, and resurrection. And so it increases to those who are keeping the conditions of the covenant. It's really, again, this saying rightly, the new covenant. The new covenant is all about the condition of the heart. And so in verse 25, it does indicate something new. Speaks of something new, something of a kind that has never existed before. Why is that? Because it's referring to a spiritual kingdom that's never existed before. Never had been this kind of kingdom before. The old Passover is like the old covenant, that's passing away. The new is instituted. A new kind of kingdom never known before, and thus a new memorial. We come to chapter 14 in verse 27 and following. Chapter 27 through 42 is a fascinating passage in this sense. It's what's called a chiasm. Did you ever hear the word? We talked about it several years ago. A chiasm is as if I took this piece of paper and I fold it right in the middle, and you read all these verses, and the point of the passage is right there in the fold. And this is set up that way. The point of this passage between verse 27 and verse 42 is in verse 34. And he says to them, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch." That's the point of the passage, that Jesus' soul is exceedingly sorrowful. Well, implied in that there is a comparison to other people who aren't. In the first half of that account, and in the second half, what's the reality? Jesus says, keep watch. They don't. They're not as grieved as Jesus is because they're more concerned about themselves. The second half of it as well. Because they're not keeping watch. What happens? Then the enemy comes to arrest him. Jesus is exceedingly grieved there in verse 34. My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. It is only he who is so grieved as to be the one who is praying. And all of the rest of them, the disciples, still a bit in a state of denial, aren't they? Being without complete understanding, yet still a bit of denial in this, and not keeping watch. Doesn't that make them also guilty of betrayal? I mean, he said, keep watch. That's a simple command. But if you don't do it, isn't that a betrayal? Think about it. We like to point at Judas, that evil man who initiated this plan, and he so loves money as to do this thing. But are the other disciples also guilty? In what way? Because the others are more concerned about self, aren't they? I know we're supposed to keep watch, but man, the flesh just wants to go to sleep. What's worse, one man's betrayal or the other 11's denial? He gave them a command, and they chose not to keep it. Am I making too much of that? I mean, really, aren't all of them guilty? In verse 27 through 31, Jesus says to them, all you shall be offended, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered abroad. Nevertheless, after I am raised up, I will go before you into Galilee. But Peter said to him, although all shall be offended, yet I will not. And Jesus says to him, truly I say to you, that you today, even before this night, before the cock crows twice, shall deny me 3 times. But he spoke exceedingly vehemently. This is Peter. Spoke exceedingly vehemently that if I must die with you, I will not deny you. And in like manner also said them all. It's sort of like Judas. We love to point a finger at Judas, but the rest of them denied him as well. We love to point a finger at Peter, but all of them were in agreement with him. So, you can blame Peter and you can blame Judas, but all of them are at fault. He says they shall be offended, or some of your translations will say they shall stumble. The original word is our word for a scandal. This scandalous thing that is about to happen, that is beyond even what they can comprehend. And it's really God who's causing the scandal. But this thing, Jesus will strike down the shepherd. Who's going to be struck down? Jesus himself. Really, Jesus himself and all that they know is their manner of religion at that time. All of it's going to be struck down. And by this, the disciples are scattered. The word means they're bewildered. I mean, if all the scandalous talk about tearing down the temple, and then now your shepherd is going to be stricken as well, what do you have to depend upon? I mean, they really are bewildered by this. Well, what's the point of even saying it? They're going to be caught in their own trap, in their carelessness not to keep watch. They're going to be caught off guard. They're really going to be cornered by the circumstances. Jesus has said, keep watch, see what's coming. But they're not. And so they're really trapped into, and by their own carelessness, they trap themselves into abandoning Jesus. And again, I'd ask, what's worse, really? Intentional betrayal or just disregard of Jesus' instruction? All of the disciples, just as we are, all of them have sinned. And so there's I think still a huge need to consider this question. As I've mentioned, we like to point out the really bad guys. Let's point to Judas. He's a real stinker. Let's point to Peter. He's a little, not too stable, we might say. But look at the rest of them. By denying Jesus, simply by not keeping his instruction. Mark has used the word twice in this, in verse 29, or in verse 30, this word deny. And he used it again, or first in Mark chapter 8, verse 34. This word deny, what does he mean? It means to disown. Now, Peter's the one that said, I never knew anything about the man. But these others, in agreeing with that, they are disowning Jesus. They're saying the same thing, aren't they? Same thing. We really don't have anything to do with him, which is a horrible thing to say.
Paul,
Yes.
I just have a question. So when they fell asleep, I'm kind of confused. If they fell asleep, they were just tired, so they weren't keeping watch. So were they actually really just denying Christ by falling asleep, or?
Well, they didn't keep a command, did they?
No, they didn't.
See, that's the point I'm trying to make. Whether you do something really heinous like Judas did, or you just decided, I'm more concerned about a little nap than keeping Jesus' command.
Yeah.
What's the result? They're going to be entrapped by that carelessness. Yeah, Jeff?
Well, it's like many of the parables that he gave, being prepared. We should always be prepared. If he asks us to be awake, that should be first thing that we should have on our mind. It's like the 10 virgins. The 5 weren't prepared, the other 5 were prepared. They were willing to go the extra mile to be prepared, just as these disciples, even though it's right after supper and we all know how our eyes get heavy,
But all of it serves directly to that point in verse 34. Jesus was deeply grieved. Is anybody else? Not really. If you're deeply grieved, do you find it easy to sleep at night? No. But, apparently they're a little more comfortable. Yeah.
Well, Jesus had told them previously in Matthew 10, he who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. What he was saying there, if you put anything before him, you're not worthy of him. And it can be your family, it can be whatever it is, whatever you put first in your life, whether it's you're tired and you're sleepy and they put their physical need, I don't think they did it knowingly.
Nope.
It just happened.
But just...
And how easily do we do the very same thing?
Well, there's this continuing, you see it throughout Mark's gospel and throughout the Bible for that matter. There's this continuing opposition between the spiritual and the flesh. The things that Jesus says to do versus the thing that it's just easier not to do. Doesn't mean that any of them are just inherently evil. But there's that opposition, isn't it? At that point, they had one command, didn't they? Just keep watch. Yes, sir.
What's unique here, Jesus says, all shall be offended. And then he says, for it's written.
Mm-hmm.
So he takes them back to Zechariah.
Yep.
And actually, it's what happened right after this. The only one that showed back up was John and Peter.
Right.
Peter denied him. The rest of them were scattered, went in the upper room and stayed there until the resurrection.
We saw it in with the opposition in chapter 11, where all those special interest groups come and they're all going to silence Jesus, and he silences them, and ultimately they don't even know what to think, and they don't even have anything to say. Well, the disciples are pretty much in that place too. Here they are, and this is happening, and this thing that they really never thought had to happen is, and there they are, they're just bewildered. They don't know what to think, what to say. But throughout the gospel, the focus is on Jesus, but there's always this kind of undertow. If you ever swim in the Gulf, you know that you're out there in the water and the waves come in and the undertow was going to wash you back out. And there's always that undercurrent that involves the disciples' weakness. Their weakness in their understanding, their weakness in their devotion. In verse 32 and following, how often does Jesus pray alone? How many times we see him praying alone? Throughout this gospel, it's mentioned several times, and beyond that, it's said he's known to get up early every morning and stay up praying every night. He prays alone. And you do get the sense, well, these men aren't near as concerned as Jesus is. And you also get the sense, well, why are they bewildered? Because they're not praying. Dina and then Jill, please.
Well, it also really puts a spotlight on what difference the gift of the Holy Spirit makes. Because you see what these men were struggling with during this time, and then after Jesus rises again. I mean, he's promised them what was going to happen. He told them this was going to be given to them. But once we get to Acts chapter 2, it's like someone flipped a switch on them. And suddenly, they're not in that mode of denying. Their whole focus was changed. And I think a lot of it has to do with that gift that the Holy Spirit strengthened them and gave them what was lacking. And we need to realize that we have the gift, not the miraculous gift, but we do have the gift of the Holy Spirit. We need to let it work to help us be less like this.
Which is as much to say we have the ability to overcome the flesh.
We do. It's there.
Yeah, it's easier not to, but we do. What'd you have, Jill?
Well, I was just curious in Luke, the account of Luke 22. I mean, he talked to them about everything that was going to happen. And then when he was praying in verse 45, it says, when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping from sorrow. So,
I'm wondering if, and I'm just doing this off the cuff, if that's the same word that Mark's using for bewildered. I mean, when you don't know what's happening.
This is the account that says sorrow.
Yep.
The others that said they were sleeping, their eyes were heavy.
Yep.
But I don't know, I mean, I'm just curious because mine says from sorrow.
I'll go back and look at that word. But think of the things that have recently happened in Mark's account, others' account. They still, even going across to the Mount of Olives the previous day, they're looking back at the beautiful buildings on the hill. And they're going, oh, what manner of buildings, all these beautiful things we read in Mark's account. They hear that's going to be torn down. Judaism's going to be torn down. Their shepherd's going to be torn down. There's just this sense, what do they have to hold on to?
So I think
some of us do that. When I'm sorrowful, I sleep. I really do. This is like, I mean, if there's real turmoil, I'm going to bed. That's just personally what, that's just me. But still, it's that flesh thing. Now, am I going to just go to bed? Or if Jesus told me to be on the alert and to keep watch, am I going to do it? It's
Like Jesus said, it wasn't real to him. I mean, honestly, like you said, Paul, we can sit there and say, well, these guys, he told them that we have this. Who's telling us? And how much do we heed it? Really, honestly, for honest with ourselves.
And that's why I asked earlier, we need to still consider this question. Yeah, we may not do the bad thing and sell Christianity out for a bit of money, but if we're ignoring Jesus' instruction, isn't the careless heart essentially the same? It's as Mark used the word deny, to not keep what Jesus has said. That is, in essence, to disown him as your Lord, isn't it? To make light of that? Yeah, Jeff?
Well, he always says that we should be diligent, not slumbering. I mean, he tells us many times, the sluggard, the one that slumbers, the one that sleeps. And he's pointing that out here to his disciples. Don't sleep. Let's be diligent. Let's get up. Let's be on alert. And
are those times, according to Luke's account, there are those times we have to work through the sorrow.
right.
That when it's, read the after Pentecost letters, the very sorrowful, difficult, trying circumstances. Sometimes you got to work through those things. Keep on.
Preparing them, because how is the devil described? Not as he's prowling, he's seeking, he's looking for those weaknesses, and he had already told Peter, Satan has asked him to sift you like wheat. Stay alert, and pay attention. And Satan does that to us, catches us, overwhelmed and everything, and then that discouragement comes in, and then that opens up the door for a whole lot of other things if we're not diligent and watching out for it.
I'm fascinated in Mark 14, verse 32 and following, where they come to this place to pray. Or he says, just sit here while I pray. Verse 33, he takes with him Peter and James and John, and began to be greatly amazed and extremely troubled. Which might be what Luke's referring to, Jill, in that word sorrow.
The word is amazed. Mine's distressed.
Distressed? Again, distressed. They're dismayed by all of this. They are troubled. I think it's interesting the three that he took with him, Peter, James, and John. Where's the last place he took these men?
On the mountain.
Which mountain?
Mount of Transfiguration.
Transfiguration. Same three guys. Now, what would they have learned from the Transfiguration?
Listen to him.
Everything previous to that is passing away. Moses is passed away. Elijah is receding into history. And God the Father says, this is my son. Listen to him. The only one. Listen to him.
His mama said, do what he says.
Yeah, of late that's been one of my favorite verses to think about. In that very simple scene at the wedding in Cana, when he changes water into wine, there's more to it than just that scene. She is really foretelling the rest of the Christian age, isn't she? Whatever he says to you, do it. You can take that all the way to the book of Revelation, can't you? One of my favorite chapters in Revelation is Revelation chapter 12, verse 11 and 17. Who are those who are going to be at the marriage feast of the Lamb? Those who held fast to the commandments of the Lord and the testimony of Christ. Whatever he says to you, do it. And again, who's going to be at that feast? That's a covenant feast. Those who did so. As devoted as those three claim to be, they are distressed. Jesus is distressed, troubled in spirit. And when it speaks of this word distress, figuratively, it's a picture of one who is far from home. When you're far from home, you're filled with this uneasiness and this dread. Deeply grieved is to be exceedingly sad. In verse 36, this cup, metaphorically, is used for the impending suffering and the death. It is a cup, it is one cup, only in this sense, that he is the one who must drink of it. Interesting, the prayer, isn't it? He comes there to pray. What's he going to ask?
This cup pass.
Verse 35, he went forward a little and fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass away from him. This whole experience might pass away. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible to you. Remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will. It's a provisional kind of request. Jesus knows what was planned and purposed from the beginning. But when you're in that state of dread and unease, as it's described like sweating drops of blood, when you're in that state of unease, it's a provisional kind of request. Just by chance, Father, if you have now seen another way that this can come to be, well, I'll agree with you, Father. We'll do it that way. But what do we know? It's the only way. It is this cup. I mean, there's some things I hate heights. And if I had to go walk across some rope bridge to rescue Dina on the other side, it would be a struggle. I'm sorry, dear, it'd still be a struggle. I mean, yeah, I will do it if but man, is there some other way?
If you keep your eyes on her and not look down, you'll be fine. Same thing with Jesus. You keep your eyes on Jesus.
Same thing on that, I've been in places like that where you've got heights and that. Don't look down. You look toward
Yeah,
Jesus.
See, I don't even have to look down. I can
That's
just
the way
think it.
I look.
I can just think it, and I could get myself so terrorized it's
I've
unreal.
been in them
Just
situations.
do I have to do this? Yes.
Well, I was thinking about,
Don't look
he took
down.
those three with him, right?
Uh-huh.
And I got to thinking, well, John was the only one that wrote anything about it. And when you look at his account, it's pretty, there's not much detail in John. But then when you go look at, like James,
Yeah.
1st and 2nd Peter, and 1st and 2nd John, you can really see the conviction from what they learned from all this.
Yeah, Mark's good about writing it that way. He kind of puts you in that place where, there's a real theatricality to Mark's writing. I mean, you're right there, you see it. Yes, Janet?
Fear always leads us into denial, whether it's a fear of heights, you're going to make excuses, you might do it, go for saving her, but you're going to think of every excuse not to.
Yep.
Whether it's a drug addict trying to get off of something, it's fear of the unknown. I think these disciples have heard this and heard this and heard this, but I still think there was a fear
And you use the word denial, and again, denial amounts to disowning. I mean, if I'm not going to cross that little rope thing to go get her on the other side, I've pretty much disowned her. And it is that dread, that terror. Yeah.
Usually it's not the fall that hurts, it's the sudden impact. So like, same thing Janet was saying, you know, the fear.
I think I'd have one advantage. I think I'd be scared to death before I hit. So I don't know. But Jesus, you know, Jesus understands these men are distressed. He really does. Look at Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 7. You know, Jesus has just prayed if there happens to be another means. Jesus understands the distress of what this is like. Do you have it, Jeff? Hebrews 5, verse 7.
During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears to the one who could save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission.
He understands what these disciples are feeling. This dread. You know, on the one hand, he's still this opposition of flesh and spirit. On the one hand, they want to be pleasing to God, but they're sorely tried by this because the flesh is weak. The flesh is always working in opposition. Yes, sir.
My translation says in the days of his flesh. You know, that to me
Yeah.
emphasizes that he was in the flesh.
What's the verse? Is it the next verse that says Jesus learned obedience by the things that he suffered?
Yeah.
Isn't that fascinating? See, he understands as a man what it is, what they dread, how they feared, how hard it is to do. But he learned disobedience by not disobedience, he learned obedience by the things that he suffered in the flesh.
I'm saying, having been made perfect, he became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation. So that's achieving that all righteousness, right? He fulfilled it.
Yeah. You know, in that sense, Jesus as a man had to learn what discipleship is too. He really had to learn, okay, this is what it's like to be a man. This is the struggle that they're facing. This is what they've got to overcome. He suffered that, but did what he was determined to do. Yes, sir.
At this time, when they're in the garden, the disciples, do they really understand yet? I mean, when he says, I will strike, as it's written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. Do they really understand that he is going to die?
Not until after he's risen.
Exactly. So they're still just kind of hanging out with him, thinking that he's still going to be around tomorrow.
Figuratively, Mark uses the word Galilee as a place of promise and of things that are good. In the times of Jesus' ministry, when he was with them and he was accomplishing these wonderful things, it was often in Galilee. That's a place where he's successful. And it's not until figuratively, or in reality after the resurrection, but figuratively they've gone to a place like Galilee in their understanding that it really comes together. And that means I have to bring this to an end. It's a good place to end, though.